He shoots, he scores. Familiar words to most Canadians, but no, this is not hockey night in Canada. This is hockey night in Israel. Our Mideast correspondent, McNabb, gives us the play-by-play.
Hey, Dave.
If Danny and Dave were back in Canada right now,
We'll listen to the news on traffic.
this road trip would be a lot different.
You know, in Toronto, if you hop in the car and 7 minutes later you're at the rink and you pay $10 for the skate.
But in Israel, well, for one, it's a little more costly. $75 for gas, another $50 per person per game. For another, it's much longer. Supper needs to be eaten on the road.
It's not ridiculously expensive compared to what we're used to, but when you're driving 3 to 4 hours each way to play a game of hockey, you got to be seriously committed and a little nuts.
Where Danny Spodek fits in is perhaps up for interpretation. But in case there was any doubt, this is proof he loves the game.
This is probably my most prized possession, and it's a young Gordie Howe.
An entire room in his Israeli home reserved for photos, jerseys, hockey cards. Every hockey card.
There he is.
Stan McNabb.
There you go.
Jeff, your favorite player, he's got that hockey card for right there.
An impressive collection he actually moved with his family almost a decade ago.
Looking at all this, to say that you like hockey would be an understatement, I think. How would you define it?
Contrary to what this room shows, I'm not obsessed. I don't have OCD or anything like that.
More like an outrageous Canadian dedicated to hockey.
You got to keep on under there?
A description that could also apply to the 30 other Canadian Jews, now living in Israel, who also play on his team. You see, in Israel, there are just 2 rinks, and the town that boasts the only regulation-size one is in Metula, about as far north in the country as you can go. So to play, you have to make the drive. True passion in the country where ice is barely understood, let alone ice hockey. Take the story of a teammate who once carried his hockey stick to a desert town.
He lives in Kibbutz Ein Gedi near the Dead Sea, and he was waiting at the bus, and somebody thought it was a shepherd's crook. He was standing there holding his hockey stick, and they thought he was a shepherd. Out of my crease! Out of his crease!
Paul Shimon was there in the beginning. In the 80s, he helped organize Israel's first team. Back then, the Canadian had to take an ad out in the paper just to find enough players.
As people saw us, they'd come out of the woodworks, and you'd find out that people had moved here in the 60s or 70s and brought their ice skates with them, thinking one day, and yes, the Holy Land was blessed with solid water.
But 2 decades after a private group of Canadians put more than $14 million into the rink and pool complex known as Canada Centre in Metula, hockey is hardly a sacred sport. Most of the 300 or so Israelis who play it regularly either grew up near a rink or with parents who grew up with hockey.
Who taught you about hockey?
My mother, because she was from Canada.
Who's your favorite hockey player?
Wayne Gretzky.
Yes, mine too.
Of course, she's Danny's daughter. Many of her teammates don't even know what the NHL is. But over the past couple of years, 3,000 Israelis have figured out the basics of the game. They're just playing it on cement instead.
This is to get the youth into playing hockey with the hopes that one day there will be ice skating somewhere closer in the country.
Every time he travels to Canada, he brings back 2 bags of equipment. Some of it is donated, a lot he pays for himself.
My ulterior motives are that one day these kids will be teenagers and I'll finally have someone to play with at home.
Part of him is joking. Another truly believes that this sport could really work in Israel.
Hockey typically is an aggressive sport. Let out all your frustrations. It's a fast game. That's pretty much how people live here. Life here is topsy-turvy. One day you're in your office working, the next day you're being called up to reserve duty to fight in a war, and things are just changing so quickly here. Hockey just completely talks to the people here.
Take the town Canada Centre is in. Surrounded by Lebanon on 3 sides, Metula's borders can't be crossed. Technically, the 2 countries are in the middle of a ceasefire, but even during our visit, rockets fired from southern Lebanon struck 2 northern Israeli towns. War is exactly why Canada Centre was formed years ago, to provide an outlet for kids.
It's fun because it's full energy.
Do you have dreams of making it to the Olympics?
Yes, I want. So want.
It's possible. Israel is a member of the International Ice Hockey Federation, and in addition to the recreational games, has an organized league. Also working in its favor, the fact some 25% of immigrants come from hockey-loving nations like Canada or Russia. But even those that play on the more competitive teams admit, without more ice rinks in the country, they're decades away from contention.
How would you compare this game to games you've seen on TV?
Oh, this is much slower.
But still fast enough for the fans. Yes, Israel has a few of those too.
Speed, coordination, checking.
I'm here for the fight.
Which brings Danny back to his original point.
Guys literally live for this. It's what gets you through all the rough times in this country.
Sure, it's not exactly the same as Canada. Here, traditional evening prayers said after the game have nothing to do with appeals for Olympic gold. At least not yet.
Dinner's for Danny.
But like Canada, the game night ends in a similar way.
The Israeli version of wings.
A chicken shawarma and a few jokes.
Who won tonight?
Yeah.
Fuel for the long drive home.